Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. You've come to a quiet corner of the world where history is told slowly, carefully, and with a calm voice meant to help you drift into rest. In this story, we'll journey back to the Roman Empire, not to walk among emperors and senators, but to step into the hidden lives of those who carried Rome on their shoulders, the millions of men, women, and children who lived and died in chains. Together, we'll follow their days in the fields, in the kitchens, in the mines, and in the gladiator schools. We'll see their suffering, their rare hopes of freedom, and the quiet flickers of humanity they clung to in the darkest of places. It is a hard story, but told gently, so that even in its wake you may find stillness, reflection, and perhaps rest. Before we begin, I'd like to ask something simple. If you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you can, leave a message in the comments telling me where in the world you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Every small gesture helps this channel grow and keeps these histories alive in the quiet of the night. So now, let your shoulders loosen, let your breathing slow, and settle into a comfortable place. The story will begin, and together we will walk into the world of ancient Rome to see what life was like for those who lived every day in chains. Part 1. Captured and Chained. The Roman Empire is often remembered for its shining marble temples, its triumphal arches, its crowded amphitheaters, and its endless roads that tied provinces to the capital. But under all of that grandeur lay a truth that defined the daily rhythm of life. Rome was a world built on slavery. The legions fought, the generals triumphed, the senators boasted, and behind all of it stood men and women who had been stripped of freedom. To understand the brutal life of slaves in the Roman Empire, we must begin at the moment when freedom was first lost. Slavery did not come suddenly to Rome. It had existed in Italian society long before Rome rose to dominance, but as the empire grew, the scale of it changed beyond measure. Every conquest meant new prisoners. Every war meant villages emptied and people marched away in chains. The roads that carried Roman soldiers to victory also carried long lines of captives. Imagine the battlefield once the fighting had ended. The dust of trampled ground still hung in the air. Shouts faded into groans of the wounded. Smoke drifted from huts and barns set alight. Among the ruins, Roman soldiers gathered those who remained alive. They did not see them as neighbors or fellow humans or equals. They saw them as spoils of war. A boy barely into manhood might be pulled from the body of his slain father. A woman clutching her infant might be pushed into line with the others. An elderly farmer, too weak to resist, might be dragged along all the same. Iron shackles were fastened on wrists and ankles. Heavy ropes linked men together, the end held by a soldier who would drive them forward like livestock. The sound of chains rattling was often the first lesson of slavery. Captivity was not simply about being caught. It was about being turned into a body that could be moved, bought, and sold. For the Romans, this was ordinary. Victories brought more than glory. They brought wealth, and the greatest wealth came in human form. A successful campaign could flood the markets with tens of thousands of captives. After the conquest of Epirus in Greece, so many were taken that the price of slaves fell sharply. The abundance of human lives became just another measure of Rome's power. The journey into slavery could last days, weeks, or months. Long lines of captives shuffled down Roman roads under the watch of guards who carried whips and spears. Some were forced to march barefoot over stones that cut into their feet. Others were packed into wagons, jolting over rough terrain. When the captives reached a river or a coast, they might be loaded onto ships. On deck, they huddled close, staring at waters that promised escape but offered none. Food was meager, often little more than bread or porridge. Water was rationed. Illness spread quickly among the weak. The young tried to comfort the very old. Parents tried to soothe crying children with whispers. Every stop along the road meant another count, another inspection, another reminder that they were no longer free people, but moving property. Not all slaves came from conquest. Pirates in the Mediterranean had long found profit in kidnapping travelers. Merchants, pilgrims, even children playing near the shore might vanish, sold far from their homelands. Though Rome later worked hard to suppress piracy, for centuries it fed the slave markets. Others entered slavery through debt. In the earliest days of Rome, a debtor unable to pay could be forced into bondage. Though reforms eased this practice in later times, the memory of it lingered. Birth also condemned many. A child born to an enslaved mother was automatically enslaved, no matter the father's status. Thus, whole generations grew up knowing no other life. The captives arrived eventually at cities and towns. Here they were pinned together, waiting for the auction. The scene was as humiliating as it was terrifying. Traders examined bodies with cold efficiency. They tested muscles, checked teeth, prodded for strength. A youth in his prime could fetch a high price. A skilled artisan might bring even more. Those with visible wounds, scars, or weakness would be sold cheaply, perhaps sent to the hardest labor where lives were short and easily replaced. Children were not spared. Buyers considered them investments, bodies that could grow into workers. Women were evaluated not only for strength, but for beauty, their fate often tied to the desires of whoever bought them. Families who had endured capture together were often separated here, scattered into different households, never to see one another again. On the auction block, traders sometimes smeared captives with oil to make their muscles shine in the sunlight. They advertised talents, a Greek who could read and write, a craftsman skilled in stone, a woman trained in weaving. Chalk marks on the forehead might list prices or notes. Buyers walked among them as if at a market of cattle. The noise of bargaining echoed through the square. For the enslaved, it was the moment when their past truly slipped away. Some captives clung to memory. A soldier from Gaul might whisper the name of his village one last time. A Greek philosopher might silently repeat lines of Homer to preserve dignity. A child might ask for a mother who had been sold moments before. Yet all of these acts of remembrance were fragile against the weight of Roman law. To the state, a slave was property. To a master, a slave was a tool. A life once full of family, tradition, and language became reduced to obedience. The first days in chains were often the hardest. The shock of losing freedom came with the shock of uncertainty. Few captives knew where they would be sent. Some would end up in wealthy villas, surrounded by marble halls and fine mosaics, yet never allowed to rest freely. Others would be marched again, this time to remote estates where fields stretched endlessly under the sun. The most unfortunate would be dragged underground into the mines, where the darkness and the dust swallowed lives and months. Even at the beginning, the body bore marks of captivity. The weight of chains bruised skin. Rope burns left red lines across wrists and shoulders. Hunger thinned faces. And yet the spirit also bore wounds. The sound of a foreign tongue shouted in command, the insult of being priced and sold, the constant reminder that resistance meant pain, all of it pressed down on the mind as heavily as iron on the flesh. Still, within the ranks of the enslaved, people sought ways to endure. They shared food when they could. They murmured prayers to familiar gods. They offered a hand to someone who stumbled on the march. Though Rome sought to erase their individuality, fragments of humanity survived. Hope flickered even in the darkest of moments. Some dreamed of escape, though it was perilous. Others clung to the chance of manumission, a freedom that might one day be granted or earned. For many, hope rested simply in making it to another sunrise. The Romans themselves rarely reflected deeply on this cruelty. To them, slavery was natural, a pillar of society as steady as stone. Senators debated politics while surrounded by servants. Merchants counted profits that depended on enslaved labor. Even philosophers, who could question the nature of the cosmos, often accepted slavery as part of the order of things. And so the story of Roman slavery always began the same way, with capture, with chains, with the stripping away of freedom. From that moment forward, every detail of life would be shaped by the will of another. The sound of chains rattling was not only the sound of restraint, it was the sound of an entire empire reminding its victims that they no longer owned their bodies, their labor, or their lives. Part 2. The Auction Block. When captives reached the end of their long march into Roman territory, their journey was not complete. The roads led them not to rest, but to the market. It was here, in the heart of the empire's towns and cities, that the process of turning human beings into property became most visible. The slave market was not hidden in shadows. It was public, noisy, and ordinary to Roman eyes. For the enslaved, it was a moment of stripping away identity. Whatever memory of freedom still lingered was broken under the gaze of buyers. The market square of a Roman town was often busy with traders, farmers, and merchants. But on the days when slaves were sold, the crowd gathered with a different anticipation. Wooden platforms were erected. Pens were filled. Scribes unrolled their wax tablets to record names, prices, and buyers. Dealers stood ready to display their human stock. The captives were herded into waiting areas, sometimes chained in groups, sometimes crowded behind crude fences. The smell of sweat and fear mingled with the dust of the square. Some were given water to keep them from collapsing. Others were washed and rubbed with oil, not for comfort, but to make their bodies shine. A slave who looked strong, healthy, and valuable fetched a higher price, and traders had every reason to disguise exhaustion or illness. When the auction began, individuals were pulled onto the platform one by one. Here, under the bright sun and the noise of the crowd, they were inspected. A buyer might step forward to prod a man's arm, testing the strength of his muscles. Teeth were pried open to judge health. Scars were examined. Were they signs of battle or of sickness? The body was measured, but so too was demeanor. Did the captive appear docile or defiant? A whip cracked nearby was sometimes enough to remind all what kind of obedience was expected. Women were displayed with equal indifference to dignity. Their bodies were examined not only for labor, but for beauty. Buyers looked for signs of fertility, for skills that might be used in weaving, nursing, or companionship. The line between servant and concubine blurred easily, and the auction block made no distinction. Children, too, were sold. A boy barely into his teens might be lifted onto the platform, his small frame held up as an investment for the future. A girl might be priced for her ability to serve in the kitchen or in her master's chambers. Families who had endured the march together often found themselves torn apart here. A father might watch his son sold to one household while he was purchased by another. A mother might hear her daughter's name called by a stranger, never to see her again. The cries of separation echoed through many such markets. The dealers used chalk to mark information directly on the bodies of those for sale. A forehead might bear a note about skills: weaver, cook, Greek speaker. Another mark might indicate special talents, such as music or literacy. Prices, too, could be written on the skin, turning the body into a tablet of commerce. A slave was presented as a list of qualities, stripped of name and history. The bidding itself could be swift or drawn out. Wealthy buyers often came prepared, knowing the type of labor they needed. A senator might purchase educated Greeks to serve as tutors for his children. A farmer might buy several strong men for the harvest. A merchant might look for young women to work in his household. Each bid was made with calculation, balancing cost against usefulness. The slave had no voice in the matter. For the enslaved, the auction was not only humiliating, but terrifying. The future was unknown, yet the buyer's gazes offered hints. A stern farmer's calloused hands might mean endless work in the fields. A merchant's fine robes might suggest a household of wealth, but also of strict discipline. A gladiator trainer's sharp eyes and scars left little doubt about the fate awaiting his purchases. Every raised hand in the crowd could decide the course of a life. Some captives tried to appear strong, hoping to attract a master who valued them and might spare them the harshest tasks. Others tried to appear weak, fearing the attention of buyers who sought beauty over labor. None of these strategies guaranteed safety. Choice belonged only to those with coins in hand. Once sold, the new slave was led away, often branded with a mark of ownership. Some bore collars inscribed with messages: "I belong to my master. If found, return me." Such collars were reminders that escape was both feared and expected. From this moment forward, the captive's life was tied to the will of another. The Romans themselves did not see the auction as cruel. To them, it was simply business. Philosophers wrote about it as if it were a natural part of life. Poets mentioned it casually. The economy depended on it so deeply that the marketplace thrived with constant supply. Wars, piracy, and birth ensured that the stream of human lives never ran dry. And yet, in the quiet between sales, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on the enslaved. A man might stare at the horizon, knowing he would never see his homeland again. A woman might hold her child tightly until the instant they were torn apart. A youth might pray silently, though the gods seemed distant in a land where chains were stronger than hope. For every buyer, the auction was the start of ownership. For every slave, it was the end of one life and the forced beginning of another. No matter how far they had traveled, no matter what they had endured on the march, it was here, on the platform, that freedom finally slipped away completely. The brutal life of Roman slaves did not begin in the fields or in the villas. It began here, under the sun, before the eyes of strangers, on the wooden boards of the auction block. It was here that human beings became property, and where the empire's appetite for labor was fed by the broken lives of those who had no power to resist. Part 3. A House Divided: Domestic Slavery. The Roman villa was the pride of the wealthy. Behind tall walls, past marble courtyards and painted columns, life unfolded in ordered splendor. Mosaics glimmered beneath sandaled feet, fountains trickled cool water into carved basins, and the air carried the scent of roasting meats and crushed herbs. To visitors, a Roman house was a place of comfort and refinement. To those who labored unseen, it was a world of constant duty and silent obedience. Domestic slaves filled these spaces, their lives bound tightly to the rhythms of their masters. From the moment the household stirred, slaves were already awake. Before the master opened his eyes, servants had lit the lamps, swept the floors, and prepared the day's clothing. Water was heated for washing, perfumes and oils were laid out, and sandals polished. A household might contain dozens of enslaved workers, each with a precise role. Some tended to the kitchen, chopping vegetables, grinding grain, or turning spits over open fires. Others cleaned and polished the atrium so that it gleamed when visitors arrived. Some cared for children, cradling infants or guiding young ones through lessons. The house itself was divided between public and private spaces. Visitors passed through the atrium and dining rooms, where masters displayed wealth with painted walls and carved furniture. Behind those spaces, in narrow corridors and windowless rooms, slaves lived. Their quarters were cramped, sometimes no more than small cells with rough bedding. Even in rest, the call of duty might summon them at any moment. Domestic slaves lived close to luxury yet never shared in it. They carried platters heavy with delicacies but ate scraps in the kitchen. They poured wine into silver cups but drank from clay vessels. They laid out soft linens on beds they would never lie upon. The contrast was constant, the nearness of beauty, the distance of freedom. The tasks of domestic life demanded patience and silence. A maid might spend hours weaving cloth on a loom, her hands moving in steady rhythm, while her mind drifted to thoughts of family long lost. A valet might stand in attendance while his master entertained guests, ready to fetch a cloak or adjust a lamp. Musicians were trained to fill the air with song during feasts, their melodies appreciated, yet their faces ignored. The Roman elite expected smooth service, and any mistake, a spilled drink, a dish served cold, a word spoken out of turn, could bring sharp rebuke or punishment. Not all positions were the same. Some slaves, especially those with education, held privileged roles. A Greek tutor might teach a master's children, reciting Homer or explaining philosophy. Such a person might be treated with a measure of respect, though never as an equal. Others became secretaries, trusted to manage correspondence, accounts, or even legal matters. Their proximity to power was real, yet fragile. At any moment, the reminder of their status, a word, a blow, a command, could cut through the illusion of closeness. For women, life in the household carried its own burdens. Female slaves might be expected to weave, cook, or nurse. Many were forced into the intimacy of their master's bed, their bodies treated as part of the household's possessions. Some bore children, who themselves entered life as slaves. The boundaries of family and servitude blurred in painful ways, as women raised children who might be sold, or who grew up knowing only chains. The presence of slaves was everywhere in a Roman household. They stood behind chairs at dinner, fanning guests or serving dishes. They followed their masters into the streets, carrying cloaks, messages, or shopping baskets. They accompanied them to the baths, waiting to rub oil into skin and scrape it away with strigils. Even in moments of leisure, the elite were never alone, always surrounded by the silent labor of others. And yet, domestic slaves sometimes caught glimpses of humanity amid the routine. A child might cling to the nurse who raised him with more affection than to his own parents. A master might reward loyal service with small favors, a better cloak, a lighter task, a chance to rest. In rare cases, trust and dependency grew deep enough that a slave might be freed, becoming a client to the household that once owned them. But such kindness was rare, and it never erased the years of servitude. The atmosphere of the villa could shift with the mood of the master. A generous master might bring music and laughter to the dining hall, where servants moved quickly to keep food and drink flowing. A harsh master might fill the air with fear, where silence was safer than speech. The unpredictability itself was part of the burden. Slaves lived not by their own rhythms, but by the tempers and whims of others. At night, when lamps were extinguished and the house grew quiet, domestic slaves returned to their quarters. Some spoke softly together, sharing memories or stories from the day. Others sat in silence, staring at walls that held no windows. Rest was brief, for dawn always came quickly, bringing another round of labor. The Romans valued order in their households, and they measured status not only by wealth, but by the number of slaves at command. To own many was to show power. To command loyalty, or at least obedience, was to display authority. Yet the cost of this grandeur was borne by those who had no choice but to serve. Domestic slavery was often considered less brutal than the fields or the mines, but its cruelty lay in its constancy. The chains were lighter, sometimes invisible, but they bound just as tightly. A life lived always in the shadow of another, without privacy, without freedom, was a life broken slowly over time. For the enslaved who walked the polished halls of Roman villas, the auction block was only the beginning. Their true labor began here, in the endless cycle of service, where every day repeated the same duties, and every night ended with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring no release. Part 4. Fields of Endless Toil, Agricultural Slavery. Beyond the walls of Rome, beyond the painted villas and the bustling markets, the empire stretched across fields that rolled endlessly to the horizon. These fields were the true foundation of Roman wealth and power: grain to feed the cities, olives pressed into oil, grapes harvested for wine. All of it flowed from the countryside into the hands of merchants, senators, and emperors. Yet none of it would have been possible without the toil of countless slaves. The estates where this work was done were called latifundia. They were enormous agricultural holdings, often formed when Roman elites seized land from conquered peoples or bought up smaller farms. In these sprawling domains, hundreds of enslaved men and women worked under the sun, their lives dictated by the rhythm of planting and harvest. To the masters who owned them, they were tools to wring profit from the soil. To themselves, they were bodies pushed to the edge of exhaustion, day after day. The day began before dawn. A horn might sound across the fields, or an overseer's shout would jolt the weary from sleep. In crude barracks, slaves rose from straw bedding, their limbs stiff from yesterday's labor. There was no leisurely meal, only a crust of bread or a ladle of thin porridge to carry them into the morning. Before the first light broke over the hills, they were already at work. Tasks varied with the season. In spring, fields had to be plowed and seeded. Teams of slaves yoked to wooden plows dug furrows, while others followed with baskets of seed, dropping grain into soil. In summer, weeds were torn by hand, vines trimmed, and irrigation channels cleared. Autumn brought the harvest when the work was at its heaviest. Men bent low, swinging sickles through golden stalks of wheat. Women and children followed behind, gathering bundles into sheaves. Grapes were plucked from vines, carried in baskets, and crushed underfoot in stone presses. Olives were shaken from branches, their oil destined for lamps and kitchens across the empire. Each task carried its own hardship. The sun beat mercilessly on uncovered heads. Dust rose from dry soil and clung to sweat. Backs ached from bending, shoulders from lifting. Overseers on horseback or with staffs moved among the workers, watching for any sign of idleness. A lash or a blow could fall without warning. The pace was relentless, for a slow harvest meant lost profit. Water was carried in jars to the fields, but thirst was constant. Food at midday was little more than bread, beans, or millet. By evening, when the day's work ended, slaves returned to their barracks exhausted, their bodies sore and blistered. Rest was shallow, broken by the knowledge that dawn would bring the same routine. Punishment for disobedience or failure was harsh. A worker who lagged behind might be whipped before the others. His cries meant his warning. Attempted escape brought worse: branding, chains, or crucifixion along the roadside. Owners feared rebellion, for the numbers of enslaved in the countryside often far outstripped the free. Overseers ruled through fear to keep the labor force subdued. The barracks where field slaves slept were simple and cramped. Dozens crowded into single rooms with rough bedding and little ventilation. The air grew heavy with sweat, smoke from cooking fires, and the murmurs of the weary. In the dim light, men and women whispered of their homelands, of family members lost, of freedom that seemed as distant as the stars. Some tried to form bonds, sharing food or offering comfort. Others withdrew into silence, their spirits worn thin. Children were not spared. Even the young carried tasks, gathering sticks, fetching water, scaring birds from fields. As they grew, they were absorbed into the endless cycle of labor. Their childhood passed not in play, but in toil, their future predetermined by chains. To the masters, the latifundia were symbols of status. A senator might boast of the hundreds of acres he owned, of the thousands of bushels of grain shipped to Rome under his name. To him, the fields represented wealth. To those who worked them, the fields represented an open prison without walls, but with no escape. The cruelty of agricultural slavery was not only physical, but also in its monotony. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into seasons. The same tasks repeated year after year. Unlike domestic slaves, who at least glimpsed the variety of city life, field slaves lived in isolation, surrounded only by soil and sky. Their world shrank to the distance of the horizon, and within that space, every sunrise carried the weight of the same burdens. And yet, even here, moments of humanity survived. A worker might pause at dusk to breathe in the cool air and watch the sun dip below the hills. Two companions might share a whispered song, recalling melodies from distant homelands. Small acts of defiance, a slowed step, a hidden handful of grain, gave tiny sparks of control. These moments could not undo the chains, but they preserved fragments of dignity. The fields of the empire produced wealth beyond measure, but their cost was hidden in the lives that were broken to sustain them. Rome's bread was kneaded from the calloused hands of slaves. Its oil was pressed from olives gathered under watchful eyes. Its wine carried the taste of toil from vines tended by those who would never drink freely. Agricultural slavery was the backbone of Rome's prosperity, and yet it was a life of endless exhaustion for those forced into it. The empire's abundance flowed from the soil, but it was fertilized not only by grain and rain, but by sweat, blood, and the quiet endurance of the enslaved. Part 5. Shackled Underground. The Mines. Of all the paths that led into slavery under Rome, few were as feared as the mines. To be condemned to labor underground was not simply to lose freedom. It was to step into a world where daylight disappeared, where the air itself could poison the lungs, and where life expectancy was measured not in years, but in months. The mines were the empire's hidden engines of wealth, feeding Rome with gold, silver, iron, and copper. Yet the cost of that wealth was paid in human lives, spent quickly and forgotten just as quickly. The journey to the mines began like any other transfer of property. A newly purchased slave deemed fit for hard labor might be marched with others to remote regions where the mountains promised treasure beneath their rock. Sometimes criminals were sent as punishment, their sentences ending not with execution, but with slow death in the depths. Captives from wars, pirates, victims, or children born into slavery could all find themselves assigned to this fate. It was a sentence without appeal. The mines were often located in barren, isolated lands, the mountains of Spain, the hills of Thrace, the deserts of Egypt. Reaching them meant days of travel through harsh terrain. Slaves were herded into fortified camps near the entrances, watched by guards who understood that escape was nearly impossible, but who never relaxed their vigilance. These camps became prisons at the edge of the earth, where the sound of pickaxes and hammers echoed from dawn until darkness. The workday began before the sun rose. Shackled in chains, workers were driven into tunnels with their tools, crude picks, hammers, and baskets for hauling stone. The air grew cooler as they descended, but it was not refreshing. Dust filled the lungs, and smoke from torches stung the eyes. In narrow shafts barely wide enough to crouch, men and women hacked at rock, the clang of metal on stone reverberating through the darkness. The labor was endless. Walls had to be broken or pried loose, baskets hauled upward by ropes. In deeper tunnels, water seeped in, soaking feet and chilling bones. In some mines, children were sent into the narrowest passages, their small bodies able to squeeze where adults could not. They carried out loads of ore, their thin arms trembling under the weight. Above ground, others worked at furnaces, feeding fires that smelted the metals, breathing fumes that burned their throats. Accidents were common. Shafts collapsed without warning, burying workers alive. Falling rocks crushed bones. The lack of light led to slips, cuts, and broken limbs. Few who were injured received care. To their overseers, slaves were expendable. A man too weak to lift a basket could be dragged outside and left to die, his place quickly filled by another purchase from the markets. The mines consumed bodies with brutal speed. The dust and fumes led to constant coughing, lungs filling with sickness, muscles strained from lifting and digging until they failed. Chains rubbed raw against skin, leaving wounds that festered. Hunger gnawed constantly. 4 rations were meager, bread hardened by the smoke, water fouled by ash. Nights brought no true rest, only a few hours on rough bedding before the guard's horns signaled the next descent into darkness. Punishment hung over the mines as heavily as the dust. Overseers carried whips and rods, quick to strike at any sign of slowing. Escape was nearly impossible, for the camps were ringed by guards, and the remote locations left no path to safety. A captured runaway could be branded, mutilated, or crucified before the others, a grim warning of what awaited defiance. The knowledge that death came slowly underground was enough to crush most thoughts of rebellion. And yet, even here, flickers of humanity remained. Workers shared water, tore bread in half, whispered encouragement in the dark. Songs sometimes echoed faintly in the tunnels, chants that kept rhythm with the swings of the pickaxe, reminders of distant homelands, prayers to gods who seemed far away. These small acts could not change their fate, but they gave shape to endurance. The Romans themselves rarely saw the mines. Gold and silver arrived in gleaming ingots, coinage struck and circulated, iron forged into weapons and tools. To them, the mines were symbols of prosperity, proof that the empire reached into the depths of the earth itself. Few asked what lives were spent to bring forth such wealth. Philosophers might note the harshness of mining in their writings, but most accepted it as the natural lot of the enslaved and condemned. The contrast between the glittering wealth of Rome and the darkness of the mines was sharp. Coins that passed through eager hands in the marketplaces carried with them the unseen cost of broken bodies. The shining helmets of soldiers, the fine jewelry of matrons, the statues cast for temples, all bore silent witness to the suffering endured in those hidden caverns. For the enslaved, the mines were not only a place of labor, but of erasure. Once sent underground, few returned. Death was constant, and memory faded quickly. A man who once tilled fields, a woman who once wove cloth, a child who once played along a riverbank, their lives disappeared into the dust. Names were forgotten, graves unmarked. The empire counted only the metal that was extracted, never the souls lost. At the surface, when dusk fell and the workers stumbled back to their camps, the silence of exhaustion weighed heavily. Chains rattled as they lay down on straw, coughing, bruised, and starved. The stars above seemed impossibly distant, glimpsed only for moments before sleep claimed them. For many, the darkness of the tunnels became the only world they knew, broken only by the brief glimmer of firelight or the faint glow of dawn. The mines were the harshest expression of Roman slavery. Where domestic slaves might know moments of comfort, and agricultural slaves might at least feel the sun and the open air, the miners lived in perpetual shadow. Their labor was not measured in years of service, but in how quickly a body could be used up. The empire that celebrated freedom for its citizens built its monuments with wealth torn from the earth by those who would never be free. To be condemned to the mines was to step into a living grave. The brutal life of Roman slaves reached its darkest depths here, where chains held not only bodies but also the last fragile threads of hope. The echo of pickaxes striking stone was the anthem of despair, a sound that resonated through tunnels and across time, reminding us that Rome's splendor was purchased with suffering hidden far from the light of day. Part 6. The Arena Awaits. Gladiator Slaves. The roar of a Roman crowd could be heard long before reaching the amphitheater. Tens of thousands of voices rose together, echoing against stone walls, vibrating through the air like thunder. To free citizens, it was the sound of excitement, of spectacle, of Rome's glory on display. To those condemned to fight, it was the sound of dread, a reminder that their lives were no longer their own. Among the many forms of slavery in the empire, none was more visible, more theatrical, and more dangerous than that of the gladiator. Gladiators were not always slaves, but many of them were. Captives from wars, criminals sentenced to punishment, or men sold into bondage could all be trained to fight. Once chosen, they were delivered to the ludus, the gladiatorial school, where their transformation began. These schools were both prisons and training grounds, ruled with iron discipline. A new recruit entered chained, his head shaved, his body examined, his future sealed. Life in the ludus followed a strict rhythm. At dawn, the clang of bells or the shouts of instructors roused the fighters. Meals of barley porridge, beans, and bread provided the fuel for long hours of training. Though food was often better than that given to field or mining slaves, for a gladiator had to remain strong, it was not a kindness. It was an investment, keeping the body ready for the demands of combat. Training yards echoed with the thud of wooden swords against posts. Recruits drilled endlessly, practicing strikes, parries, and footwork until their bodies moved with instinct. Wooden weapons gave way to real blades as skill grew, and mistakes could draw blood. The instructors, many of them former gladiators, enforced discipline with harsh punishments. A man who faltered might be flogged before his companions, a reminder that hesitation in the arena meant death. Each fighter was assigned a style. Some learned the heavy armor and short sword of the secutor, moving with deliberate strength. Others trained as retiarii, armed with net and trident, relying on speed and agility. There were murmillos, hoplomachy, threses, each with its own weapons, armor, and traditions. The variety ensured that battles in the arena were never predictable, each pairing carefully chosen to thrill the crowd. The ludus was not only a place of training, but also of confinement. Gladiators lived in barracks, locked behind gates when not in the yard. They ate together, trained together, sometimes fought together, but freedom was beyond reach. Conversations in the dim light often turned to speculation: how long before their first match, what opponent they might face, whether fortune or death awaited them. Despite the harshness, bonds formed. Men who trained side by side came to trust one another, even as they knew that the arena might one day pit them against each other. Some found pride in their skill, a small sense of identity reclaimed in mastering weapons. Others clung to hope that victory after victory might bring fame, and perhaps even the rare gift of manumission. Yet for most, the ludus was simply another set of chains, different only in that the end of the road was fought before thousands of eyes. When the day of combat came, the atmosphere shifted. Gladiators were led from their barracks, their armor polished, their weapons sharpened. They marched through tunnels beneath the amphitheater, the rumble of the crowd growing louder with every step. The smell of dust, sweat, and anticipation filled the air. Emerging into the sunlight, they were blinded momentarily by the brightness and the sight of the masses who had gathered to watch them fight for survival. The arena floor was a stage of death. Sand was spread to soak up blood, banners fluttered above, and officials presided over the games. Trumpets sounded, and the matches began. For the spectators, it was entertainment, a display of courage, skill, and violence. For the gladiators, it was a battle not only against an opponent, but against the certainty of mortality. The crowd's reaction could sway fate. A defeated fighter might look to the presiding official and to the audience, awaiting the signal, mercy or death. A thumb turned one way could spare him, turned the other could condemn him. In that moment, thousands of voices decided the worth of a man's life. Few examples capture more starkly the powerlessness of slaves in Rome than this dependence on the whims of a crowd. Death in the arena was frequent, though not always immediate. Gladiators were valuable investments, and owners did not wish to lose them too quickly. Many matches ended with serious wounds rather than death, and injured fighters were carried from the sand to heal so they could fight again. But each return to the arena carried the same risk. The longer a man fought, the more certain it became that one day he would not rise again. Some gladiators gained fame, their names known across the empire. Crowds cheered for their skill, poets wrote of their victories, women admired their courage. But behind the glory lay the reality of chains. Even the most celebrated gladiator returned each night to the barracks, locked away like any other slave. Fame did not erase servitude. For the enslaved, the life of a gladiator was filled with contradictions. It offered better food, stronger bodies, and sometimes admiration, but it demanded constant risk, constant readiness for violence, and the knowledge that survival was always uncertain. It was a life lived under the shadow of spectacle, where dignity was stripped away, replaced by the role of entertainment for the free. When the games ended and the crowds dispersed, the sand of the arena bore silent witness to what had passed. Bloodstains, broken weapons, bodies carried away. For Rome, it was celebration. For the gladiators, it was survival, at least until the next trumpet call. The brutal life of Roman slaves found no more public stage than in the amphitheater. The mines consumed lives in darkness, the fields in silence, the households in shadow. But the gladiator's chains were displayed before all. His suffering turned into spectacle, his death into applause. In the arena, the empire revealed its appetite for blood and its indifference to those who shed it. Part 7. Chains on the Road, Public Slaves. The grandeur of Rome did not rest only in its villas or its fields. It was visible in its streets, its bridges, its aqueducts, and its monuments. Travelers approaching the city saw aqueducts arching over valleys, carrying water across miles of stone channels. They walked on paved roads that stretched in straight lines through the empire, so well built that some survive to this day. They stood beneath towering temples, amphitheaters, and baths. Yet all of this required constant care. Behind the marble and the mortar, behind the fountains and the public squares, stood the labor of slaves owned not by private households but by the Roman state itself. These were the publici servi, the public slaves. Unlike domestic slaves who belonged to families, or agricultural slaves who belonged to estates, public slaves were considered the property of the community. In Rome itself, they were owned by the city. In provincial towns, they belonged to the local council. Their lives were not their own, but their masters were collective rather than individual. This difference did not mean freedom. It meant that their duties served the public eye, their chains tied to the smooth running of society. A day in the life of a public slave often began with the first stirrings of the city. Streets needed sweeping after the night's refuse. Dust and filth were cleared before the shops opened. Public fountains, the lifeblood of neighborhoods, had to be cleaned and repaired. Water was carried in buckets, leaks patched with plaster, channels scrubbed free of debris. To the citizens filling their jars in the morning, the fountain seemed as natural as the sunrise. Few paused to wonder who kept the water flowing. Public slaves worked in teams on the great aqueducts, those marvels of engineering that brought water from distant hills into Rome. They climbed ladders to inspect arches, descended into channels to clear blockages, and hauled stones to reinforce crumbling sections. The work was hard, the hours long, and accidents frequent. A slip from a high arch could mean instant death. A misstep in a channel could trap a man in rushing water. Yet the labor never ceased, for the city demanded water for its baths, its fountains, and its sewers. Others were tasked with maintaining the roads. The empire's network stretched for tens of thousands of miles, paved with stone slabs that endured the weight of armies and merchants alike. Slaves cut weeds from the edges, replaced broken stones, and filled ruts worn by wagon wheels. In the heat of summer or the chill of winter, they labored in sight of travelers who hurried past, seldom sparing a glance. The building of monuments also drew heavily on public slaves. Temples, theaters, and triumphal arches rose not only from the designs of architects, but from the sweat of those who hauled stone, mixed mortar, and carved detail. The Colosseum itself, that symbol of Roman power, was built in part by enslaved labor. For every crowd that marveled at its vastness, there were countless hands that had carried the weight of its creation. Not all duties were heavy labor. Some public slaves served as clerks, record keepers, or assistants in government offices. Literacy made them valuable in these roles, though they remained property all the same. They copied documents, kept accounts, and managed archives, their skills used to maintain the machinery of empire. Others served as attendants in temples, sweeping floors, tending fires, or assisting priests in rituals. A few gained positions of relative responsibility. Inscriptions survive that speak of public slaves who managed other workers, or who oversaw sections of aqueducts or temples. Some even became trusted enough to hold keys to treasuries or storerooms. But these privileges did not erase their status. However trusted, however skilled, they remained bound. Their titles were reminders not of freedom, but of how deeply slavery was woven into Rome's order. The conditions of public slavery varied widely. Those assigned to clerical tasks might live in modest quarters near their offices, sleeping on benches or in shared rooms. Those working the roads or aqueducts often lodged in rough barracks outside the city, rising before dawn to march to their sites. Food was basic: bread, porridge, perhaps olives or beans, but enough to sustain constant labor. Rest was brief, the call of duty constant. Punishments were as harsh as anywhere else. A mistake in records, a broken tool, a missed task could bring lashes. Attempted escape was treated with severity. Branded collars marked some public slaves, inscriptions warning all that they were property of the city. The humiliation was not only in being owned by another, but in being owned by all, their servitude visible to every passerby. And yet, for all the hardship, there was a strange visibility to public slavery. Unlike the hidden lives of field slaves or the darkness of the mines, public slaves worked where all could see them. Citizens walked past them daily, drew water from fountains they maintained, bathed in aqueduct-fed baths they repaired. They were essential, present in every aspect of urban life, and yet invisible as individuals. To the eyes of Rome, they blended into the background, their humanity drowned beneath their function. Some found small dignity in their work. A clerk might take pride in neat handwriting, a stonemason in a well-fitted block. A fountain tender might pause to watch water flow smoothly after a long repair. These moments were not freedom, but they were fragments of meaning, ways to endure in a life stripped of choice. Occasionally, loyalty or long service brought rewards. A public slave might be manumitted, granted freedom by the state. Such cases were rare, but inscriptions record freedmen who had once served as clerks or temple attendants. For most, however, life remained a cycle of labor without end, tied not to one master's household, but to the empire itself. As evening fell, the city quieted, but duties lingered. Streets still needed sweeping, lamps needed tending, and fires and temples had to be kept alive through the night. Public slaves moved silently through the darkened streets, their chains clinking softly, the unseen custodians of the empire's order. When they returned to their quarters, they lay down weary, knowing that with the dawn, the cycle would begin again. Rome prided itself on order, on roads that stretched unbroken, on fountains that never failed, on monuments that stood unshaken. But beneath this order lay chains, carried not by citizens, but by those whose labor was demanded without reward. The brutal life of slaves extended into every corner of the empire, and the public slaves were the threads that tied city and state together. Their work was visible to all, yet their suffering remained unnoticed. absorbed into the background hum of Roman life. For the empire to shine, they endured the shadows. For aqueducts to flow, they bent their backs. For roads to endure, they wore down their bodies. They were the quiet force that sustained Rome's grandeur, and yet they lived and died without names remembered. Their lives spent in service not to one master, but to a world that never cared to see them at all. Part 8. The Cruel Hand of Punishment. Slavery in Rome was built not only on labor but on fear. Masters controlled their slaves not simply by ownership, but by the constant reminder of punishment. Every task, every word, every gesture was shaped by the knowledge that disobedience or failure could bring pain. In the Roman imagination, a slave was property, a tool, a res, a thing to be used. If that tool failed, it could be corrected, repaired, or destroyed. The law gave masters wide authority, and custom gave them permission to enforce it with cruelty. For the enslaved, punishment was part of daily life. It was not reserved for crimes, but for mistakes, delays, or even for no reason at all. A spilled cup of wine, a dish served too cold, a step taken too slowly in the fields, all could bring swift retribution. The whip was the most common instrument. Strips of leather cracked against backs and shoulders, leaving welts that burned for days. Sometimes lead or bone was tied into the lash, cutting flesh with every stroke. The memory of its sting lingered, a constant reminder of obedience. Branding was another mark of control. Some masters burned symbols or letters into the skin of their slaves, often on the forehead, declaring ownership to all who saw. Others forced collars of iron around necks, inscribed with humiliating messages, "I belong to my master. If I flee, return me." These collars made escape nearly impossible, for anyone who encountered a runaway could see immediately that he or she was property. The collar was heavy, uncomfortable, and degrading, a punishment that continued every hour of the day. More severe penalties awaited those who resisted. A slave who struck a master could be executed. One who attempted escape might be branded, mutilated, or even crucified. Crucifixion was a punishment reserved for the worst offenders, rebels, runaways, or entire groups suspected of revolt. Slaves were nailed or tied to wooden crosses along roadsides, left to die slowly under the sun. The sight was a message as much as a punishment. Travelers saw the bodies hanging, and every slave who passed by understood the warning. Resistance ended in agony. The Romans believed that terror preserved order. In large households or estates, where slaves outnumbered the free, fear was considered necessary. Overseers carried rods and whips, using them to enforce discipline. The crack of leather across flesh echoed through fields, kitchens, and workshops, a sound as common as the calls of merchants or the chatter of markets. Children learned early to obey, watching their elders punished for the smallest mistakes. Public punishment was especially common. A master might order a flogging to take place before the other slaves, turning one person's suffering into a lesson for all. The cries of pain were meant to sink into memory, binding obedience not only through the lash but through dread of becoming the next example. Some punishments were drawn out deliberately. Slaves might be chained together, forced to carry heavy weights as penance for laziness. Others might be confined in dark cells, fed on scraps, left to reflect on their failure. The goal was not only to cause pain, but to break spirit, to remind the enslaved that resistance was useless. Even in the city, where public order mattered, punishments were harsh. A runaway captured in Rome could be paraded through the streets, beaten as the crowd looked on. Some were forced to wear placards announcing their crimes, shaming them as well as injuring them. In amphitheaters, slaves condemned for rebellion could be thrown to wild beasts, their deaths turned into entertainment. The cruelty was not hidden but displayed, reinforcing the hierarchy that placed masters above and slaves beneath. Yet not all punishment was physical. Masters could also wield psychological control. Threats of separation from family were powerful. A child could be sold, a husband or a wife sent away. The fear of losing those few bonds made obedience more likely than the lash alone. Silence, too, was a weapon. A master's cold dismissal, a sudden withdrawal of trust, a refusal to acknowledge a slave's presence, these, combined with the constant threat of violence, eroded the soul as much as the body. Roman law permitted much of this. A master had near absolute power over life and death. Though philosophers sometimes questioned the cruelty, their voices were faint against the weight of custom. Some masters prided themselves on leniency, claiming to rule with kindness rather than fear, but such cases were exceptions. For most, discipline was harsh because harshness was expected. The cruelty of punishment lay not only in its severity, but in its unpredictability. A slave never knew when a mistake might bring pain. Even faithful service could end with a blow if the master's temper flared. This uncertainty created constant anxiety, an invisible chain tighter than any iron. Every task was done with caution. Every word spoken with care, every movement weighed against the possibility of punishment. And yet, despite the severity, punishment did not erase humanity. Some slaves endured, clinging to small acts of resistance, a hidden glance of defiance, a whispered word of comfort to the punished, a memory of freedom preserved in silence. They could not escape the lash, but they could refuse to let it erase their identity. The brutal life of Roman slaves was defined by labor, but it was enforced by punishment. The whip across the back, the brand on the skin, the collar around the neck, the body hanging on a cross, these were the tools by which Rome maintained its order. Every monument, every feast, every march of legions rested on a foundation of fear. And for the enslaved, fear was not an occasional shadow, but a constant companion, a weight carried as heavily as any chain. Part 9. Flickers of Humanity. The story of Roman slavery is one of chains, fear, and unrelenting toil. Yet within that darkness, small sparks of humanity continued to glow. The empire sought to strip the enslaved of identity, reducing them to property, but people are never only what laws or masters declare them to be. Even in the hardest conditions, men and women found ways to remember who they were, to build fragile bonds, and to preserve the essence of being human. These flickers of humanity took many forms. They appeared in whispered words at night, in secret gestures of kindness, in moments when laughter slipped past the weight of sorrow. To the Romans, such things were invisible. To the enslaved, they were life itself. In the crowded quarters of domestic slaves, conversation softened the edges of long days. After hours of serving in kitchens, sweeping atriums, or tending children, men and women returned to narrow cells where they lay close together. In the dim light, they spoke of their homelands, telling stories of villages by rivers or mountains, now far away. Songs were hummed quietly, melodies carried across generations. Children listened wide-eyed, hearing of places they might never see, but which lived on in the memory of their parents. These stories were not rebellion, but they were survival. They preserved roots that chains could not sever. On the estates of the countryside, where field slaves labored from dawn to dusk, bonds formed in the rhythm of work. Men cutting wheat side by side learned to move in step, their voices rising in chants to keep the sickles steady. Women gathering grapes sang softly, their harmonies weaving through the vines. Even children joined in, their small hands learning the same motions, their voices carrying hope. In these shared labors, friendship was forged, fragile, fleeting, but real. Love, too, found a place in the shadows of slavery. Men and women sought one another's company, sometimes with the master's permission, sometimes in secrecy. They formed unions not recognized by law, but deeply felt in their hearts. Children born from these bonds entered life already enslaved, yet their existence testified to the refusal of despair. A father carried his child on weary shoulders after a day in the fields. A mother sang lullabies at night, her voice a shield against the harshness of the world outside their quarters. These moments of tenderness gave meaning to lives otherwise consumed by labor. In the darkness of the mines, where days ended in coughing and chains, humanity appeared in acts as small as sharing water or steadying another's basket. A whispered prayer, a song hummed in unison, a touch of a hand in the dark. These gestures could not undo the cruelty, but they reminded the enslaved that they were not alone. Companionship made the unbearable just slightly more bearable. Some masters allowed slaves small freedoms, though always within limits. A trusted domestic slave might be given coins to manage purchases, a secretary entrusted with important documents, a nurse allowed to keep her own child close. These privileges were not rights. They could be taken away at any moment. Yet even small liberties could give space for identity to survive. A Greek tutor might slip a favorite line of poetry into a lesson. A musician might play not only for feasts, but for himself in the quiet of the night. A cook might add a pinch of herbs from his homeland into a dish, leaving a trace of memory hidden in flavor. Religious practices offered another refuge. Many slaves carried their gods with them into bondage. Small shrines were built in corners of barracks, offerings of bread, oral, placed with reverence. Prayers were whispered in languages the masters did not understand. Some adopted the gods of Rome, seeking protection from Jupiter or healing from Aesculapius. Others clung to older traditions, Egyptian, Greek, Gallic, or Judean, preserving belief as a link to the past. Religion gave meaning, a sense that suffering was seen by powers greater than any master. The festivals of Rome provided rare moments when boundaries blurred. During Saturnalia, for a brief time each winter, roles were reversed. Masters served meals to slaves, gifts were exchanged, and laughter filled the air. Though temporary and symbolic, for many enslaved people Saturnalia was a glimpse of dignity, a reminder that the order of the world was not unshakable. Some cherished those days all year, replaying the memory when the whip cracked again. There were also stories of loyalty that surprised even the Romans. Inscriptions record slaves who cared for sick masters, who saved households from fire, who remained faithful even when freedom was near. These tales were celebrated by Romans as proof of devotion, but to the enslaved, they were complex. Loyalty could grow from affection, from shared years, or from the simple calculation that kindness might bring manumission. Whatever the motive, they showed that even within chains, relationships could form that defied easy definition. The greatest flicker of humanity, however, was hope. Hope for manumission, for freedom, for a life beyond chains. Though rare, manumission did happen, and stories of freedmen spread through slave communities like sparks in dry grass. A friend of a friend who had earned his freedom. A tutor released after years of loyal service. A woman freed to marry her master. Each tale fed the possibility that the future could change. Not all hope was directed toward freedom. For some, it was hope that their children might know a gentler life. For others, hope was found simply in enduring, living another day, surviving another lash, holding on to memory despite erasure. Hope was fragile, often disappointed, but without it the weight of slavery would have been unbearable. The Romans seldom noticed these sparks of humanity. To them, slaves were labor, background figures in the theater of daily life. Yet these flickers endured, hidden beneath obedience. They were not rebellions in the grand sense, but they were rebellions of the soul, acts of preservation that refused complete erasure. The brutal life of slaves in the Roman Empire was defined by chains, but it was not only chains. It was also shaped by the quiet courage to remember, to love, to laugh, to hope. These flickers did not undo the cruelty, but they prevented the system from extinguishing humanity altogether. And in their persistence, they remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, people found ways to remain human. Part 10. Whispers of Resistance. The Roman system of slavery was designed to be absolute. Masters held power over life and death. Overseers carried whips. Laws recognized the enslaved as property. Yet even within such a system, resistance found its way forward. Rarely could a slave overthrow his condition. Rarely could one escape entirely. But within the boundaries of chains and fear, there were whispers of resistance, subtle, quiet, often invisible to the masters, but powerful in their assertion that slavery had not erased the will to act. Resistance could begin with something as simple as slowing one's pace. In the fields, a worker might bend a little more slowly, swing the sickle with less force, gather fewer sheaves of wheat in a day. The overseer's eyes might not always catch it, but the intention was there to deny the full measure of labor expected to reclaim time even in small fragments. In the kitchens of great villas, a cook could spoil a dish with too much salt, or serve wine less sweet than expected. These were not accidents. They were choices, ways to express defiance without words. Tools broke often in the hands of slaves. A plowshare might snap, a jar might fall, a rope might fray. Sometimes it was chance. Sometimes it was deliberate. Sabotage was a dangerous form of resistance, for discovery could bring harsh punishment. Yet the temptation to weaken the instruments of labor, to slow the master's wealth, was strong. Even the smallest damage was a reminder that the enslaved were not entirely helpless. Escape was the boldest form of resistance. Throughout the empire, slaves fled their masters, seeking refuge in forests, mountains, or among sympathetic communities. Some found temporary freedom, surviving as bandits or blending into the poor free population. Many were caught, dragged back, punished severely. The collars inscribed with warnings, "I am a slave, return me to my master," testified to how common the fear of flight was. Yet the fact that so many attempted it shows how fiercely the desire for liberty burned. Songs carried resistance too. In the fields, in barracks, in mines, men and women hummed melodies from their homelands, verses that masters could not always understand. These songs preserved identity and defied erasure. They said, "We are still ourselves," even when Roman law denied it. A chant in the mines could keep rhythm for pickaxes, while reminding workers that they belonged to something older and greater than their chains. Religion offered another path. Some slaves adopted Roman gods, but many clung to their own traditions. In hidden corners, they whispered prayers to deities from Greece, Gaul, Egypt, or Judea. These prayers were not always petitions for deliverance. Sometimes they were declarations. Our gods see us. Our gods remember us. To worship secretly was to resist the complete assimilation that Rome demanded. There were also moments of collective defiance. In the fields, groups might slow their work together, making it harder for overseers to punish one without punishing all. In households, slaves sometimes coordinated subtle acts, delaying messages, misplacing items, sharing information that the master wished kept secret. These acts might seem small, but they revealed unity. The enslaved were not merely isolated individuals. They were communities that could act together, however quietly. Masters feared resistance, even in whispers. Their fear was justified, for history records great uprisings, like that of Spartacus. But just as powerful, in a quieter way, were the daily refusals, the constant undercurrent of defiance. The whip could command labor, but it could not erase the desire to resist. Some masters sought to stamp out even the smallest signs. A laugh at the wrong time, a glance exchanged between slaves, a song sung too loudly, all could bring reprimand. They understood, even if only dimly, that these moments carried power. A body could be broken, but spirit was harder to chain. Stories of escape or defiance spread quickly. A slave who dared to flee, even if captured, became a legend in whispered conversations. A worker who stood tall under punishment, refusing to cry out, was admired quietly by companions. These stories sustained courage, reminding all that resistance was possible, even in defeat. Even acts of kindness could be resistance. To share food when rations were meager, to hide an injured companion from an overseer's wrath, to comfort a child torn from its mother, these were choices that defied the master's attempt to turn slaves into objects. By caring for one another, the enslaved refused to let cruelty define them completely. At times, resistance became more visible. Arson struck estates, tools were destroyed, and warehouses of grain burned. The authorities called these crimes, but for the enslaved, they were desperate cries for recognition. Such acts were rare, for punishment was swift and brutal, yet their memory lingered in fear among masters and in hope among slaves. The Romans boasted of control, but control was never absolute. Chains restrained bodies, not thoughts. Punishment silenced voices, but whispers continued. Resistance lived in the decision to walk more slowly, to sing a forbidden song, to dream of freedom despite every attempt to crush hope. The brutal life of Roman slaves was not only submission, it was also resilience, expressed in small acts of courage that the empire never fully saw. These whispers of resistance remind us that even in the face of overwhelming power, people found ways to assert their will, to claim fragments of dignity, and to say, in their own quiet ways, that they were still human. Part 11. The Great Uprising. For centuries, Roman masters had trusted in fear to hold their slaves in place. The whip cracked, collars weighed heavy, punishments loomed over every mistake, and the law reinforced the idea that human beings could be property. Most of the time, resistance remained hidden. Slaves whispered in the dark, slowed their steps in the fields, or dreamed quietly of escape. Yet sometimes silence shattered. Sometimes defiance burst into the open. In the 1st century before Christ, a rebellion erupted that became so vast, so dangerous, that it shook the confidence of Rome itself. At its heart stood a man whose name still echoes today, Spartacus. The story began in Capua, a wealthy city in southern Italy, where one of the great gladiatorial schools stood. Inside its walls, men trained not as free soldiers, but as property meant to fight for the amusement of Roman crowds. There were Gauls, Thracians, Greeks, and Germans, men who had once tilled fields, marched in armies, or lived freely in their homelands. Now they were kept behind locked gates, their bodies hardened through endless drills, their spirits worn down by captivity. Among them was Spartacus, a Thracian of unusual presence. Some accounts describe him as once a soldier, captured and enslaved. Others suggest he had deserted the Roman army and been punished with bondage. Whatever the details, he became a gladiator and soon a leader. Life in the gladiator school was harsh. Training filled the days with the clang of wooden swords and the weight of heavy shields. Guards watched closely, ready to punish hesitation. The food was better than what most slaves ate: barley porridge, beans, bread, sometimes meat, but this was no kindness. A gladiator had to remain strong, for he was an investment, a body trained for combat in the arena. The amphitheater loomed like a shadow over their existence. Every man knew that when he stepped into the sand, survival would depend on courage and fortune. Death was not only possible, but expected. For many, despair silenced thought of change. But Spartacus looked at the men around him and saw more than fighters for the amusement of Rome. He saw warriors. He saw soldiers. And he understood that together, with weapons in their hands and desperation in their hearts, they might break free. In 73 BCE, a group of about 70 gladiators decided to act. Armed at first with nothing more than knives from the cookhouse and bits of iron seized from the kitchens, they rose in revolt. They overpowered their guards, stormed through the gates, and fled the school. On their way out, fortune favored them. They captured wagons loaded with real weapons. Swords, shields, and spears passed into the hands of men who had been trained to use them, not as slaves in the arena, but as soldiers in battle. The fugitives took to the countryside, eventually climbing to refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. At first, the Roman authorities saw them as a nuisance, runaway slaves who would soon be hunted down and killed. But when soldiers tried to trap them, the rebels struck back. Using ropes and ladders woven from vines, they descended the cliffs in secrecy, flanked the Romans, and crushed them. Word spread quickly. For the first time, slaves had not only fled, but won. From farms and estates across Campania, more slaves escaped and joined them. Shepherds came from the hills. Miners, scarred by darkness and dust, found their way to the camp. Men brought sickles, axes, and hammers. Women carried children and food. All came seeking freedom. What had begun as a desperate escape grew into a movement. Spartacus emerged as the leader, not by declaration but by the loyalty he inspired. He treated his men with fairness, shared their hardships, and proved himself a master of strategy. Under his command, the rebels began to look less like fugitives and more like an army. Roman forces sent against them fell again and again. The Senate was humiliated as its legions, trained and disciplined, suffered defeats at the hands of men who only months earlier had been bound in chains. Panic spread through the countryside. Villas were abandoned, landowners fled, and towns feared raids. The rebels moved swiftly, striking where they wished, feeding their numbers with every victory. At the height of the rebellion, their ranks may have swelled to 70,000. The question of what to do next hung heavily over the camp. Some said Spartacus intended to lead his people north, across the Alps, scattering them into freedom beyond Rome's reach. Others believed the army had grown too bold to turn away, that many among them preferred to remain in Italy, raiding and taking what Rome had denied them. Whatever Spartacus truly intended, disagreements divided the rebels, and precious time slipped away. Meanwhile, Rome gathered its strength. The Senate entrusted command to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in the city, and one determined to prove his worth through victory. Crassus rebuilt discipline in the legions with ruthless methods, even reviving the punishment of decimation, where every 10th man in a disgraced unit was executed by his comrades. Fear restored order, and under his leadership, Rome pressed hard against the rebels. The fighting was bitter. Spartacus's men broke through Roman lines more than once, outmaneuvering their pursuers and striking with the ferocity of men who had no choice but to win or die. Yet the net closed slowly. Crassus built trenches and fortifications to pen them in, cutting off supplies, tightening the grip. The rebel army, so vast only months before, began to weaken under hunger and fatigue. The final battle came in southern Italy. Outnumbered and hemmed in, Spartacus rallied his men. Ancient writers describe him fighting with desperate courage, cutting a path toward Crassus himself before being overwhelmed. He fell with sword in hand, refusing to flee. His body was never found, lost among the thousands slain. His followers were crushed, scattered, or captured. For those captured alive, the fate was merciless. Along the Appian Way, the great road stretching from Capua to Rome, 6,000 slaves were crucified. For miles, crosses lined the roadside, each bearing a body writhing in agony or already lifeless. Travelers passing along the route saw not only death, but Rome's message carved into the landscape. Defiance would not be tolerated. The rebellion was drowned in blood. Yet though it ended in horror, the memory of the uprising endured. For the Romans, it was a scar of shame, proof that the people they called property could terrify even the greatest power in the Mediterranean. For the enslaved, though their voices were silenced in public, the name Spartacus carried in whispers. It was a name of defiance, of courage, of the dream that chains could be broken. The revolt did not end slavery. The fields were still harvested, the mines still dug, the villas still staffed with men and women who had no freedom. Rome's economy, its comfort, and even its grandeur continued to rest on the backs of the enslaved. But Spartacus had shown something that Rome could never entirely forget. Slavery was not natural. It was not eternal. It was a system upheld by fear, and fear could be challenged. The brutal life of Roman slaves was defined by labor and punishment, by humiliation and despair. Yet, in the story of Spartacus, we glimpse something more. We see men who dared to rise, women who followed them, children who walked beside them, all defying the empire that had sought to erase their humanity. The rebellion ended in crucifixion, but the idea it embodied lived on. The idea that even the mightiest empire could not wholly crush the longing for freedom. Part 12. Hopes of Freedom. The life of a slave in Rome was shaped by chains, by fear, by the endless cycle of labor and obedience. Yet even in that world of submission, there lingered a fragile dream that not all chains lasted forever. Among the whispers in barracks and fields, in kitchens and in mines, one word rose again and again: manumission, the granting of freedom. It was not common, it was never guaranteed, and for most it remained only a dream. But it existed, and that possibility changed the way some endured their bondage. Hope became a kind of sustenance, as necessary as bread or water. Manumission took many forms. A master could free a slave out of affection, gratitude, or pride. A tutor who had taught children faithfully for years, a nurse who had raised generations of a family, a secretary who had managed accounts with precision, these might, on rare occasions, be rewarded with liberty. The act was often ceremonial. A master might declare freedom before witnesses, touch the slave with a staff, or record the decision with officials. The state recognized the new status, and the slave became a freedman or freedwoman, a libertus or liberta. Others earned freedom through long service. Some masters promised liberty after a certain number of years, though such promises were not always kept. A slave might cling to the hope that loyalty and obedience would one day be rewarded. The years dragged by in toil, but the thought that release might come gave endurance to bodies pushed to exhaustion. In the rare cases where the promise was fulfilled, the day of freedom was remembered as a second birth. There were also those who bought their own freedom. A slave who managed to save small coins, tips from errands, gifts from a kind master, wages from skilled work, could build a private fund called the peculium. Though technically still owned by the master, this money could sometimes be used to purchase release. The process required trust, for a master could at any moment confiscate the savings. Yet for some, the peculium was a lifeline, a path to a future shaped by their own efforts. The granting of freedom did not erase the past. A freedman carried the mark of slavery in memory and in law. He owed loyalty to his former master, now called his patron. He might still work for him, perform duties, or pay respect. Social status was limited, for freedmen could not hold high public office or claim the honors of the elite. But freedom, even with limits, was freedom. A freedman could marry legally, raise children who were born free, own property, and walk the streets without fear of the whip. For women, manumission carried its own possibilities and burdens. Freed women often became clients of their former masters, still tied by obligation, but they gained the right to marry and to bear free children. Many worked as shopkeepers, midwives, or artisans, carving out small places in the crowded life of the city. Their status was fragile, yet it was immeasurably better than life in chains. The ceremonies of manumission reflected the importance Romans placed on freedom as a concept, even while they denied it to so many. In temples, slaves were sometimes freed before statues of gods, as if divine witness sanctified the act. Others were recorded formally by magistrates, their names inscribed on tablets as new citizens of Rome. A freedman might exchange the rough tunic of a slave for the cap of liberty, the pileus, a soft felt cap that marked his new identity. To put it on was to feel the weight of chains lift, if only in part. Not all masters freed slaves out of generosity. Some did it for calculation. By freeing older or less useful slaves, they avoided the cost of supporting them. Others freed loyal servants in their wills, leaving liberty as a final gift after death. A few even freed dozens at once, seeking to display their wealth and magnanimity. For the enslaved, the motives mattered little. Freedom, however it came, was priceless. The life of a freedman was not easy. Prejudice remained. Citizens born free looked down on those who had once been property. Insults and suspicions followed them. Yet many carved out successful lives. Some became craftsmen, merchants, even wealthy businessmen. Their children, born free, could rise higher, entering trades, politics, or even the Senate in later generations. In this way, freedom opened a door not just for one life, but for a lineage. Stories of manumission spread quickly among the enslaved. A cook who had earned his liberty, a nurse freed after decades of faithful care, a tutor who saved enough to buy release. These stories traveled like sparks, feeding the fragile flame of hope in the darkest corners of slavery. Men in the fields whispered them as they bent over their work. Women in the kitchens repeated them as they stirred pots. Miners in the dark held them close as they swung their picks. Each tale was a reminder that, though rare, freedom was not impossible. Even Saturnalia, the winter festival when roles were symbolically reversed, fed that hope. For a few days each year, masters served meals to slaves. Laughter replaced commands, and the enslaved tasted a strange, fleeting equality. When the festival ended, chains returned, but memories lingered. If the world could be inverted for a week, perhaps it could change forever. Still, for the vast majority, manumission never came. They lived and died in bondage, their names unrecorded, their hopes unfulfilled. The dream of freedom sustained them, but did not save them. Rome's wealth demanded too many bodies, and masters had little reason to loosen their grip. Freedom was a rare prize, dangled before many, but given to few. For those who received it, the day of manumission was unforgettable. The moment when the collar was removed, when chains were struck off, when the pilius was placed upon the head, it was as if life began anew. For a man who had been whipped in fields or forced into the arena, to walk through the streets as a citizen was to feel the impossible become real. For a woman who had been bound to service, to stand before her children and know they were free was a triumph beyond words. The brutal life of Roman slaves offered little light, but the hope of manumission was one of the few glimmers. It was fragile, uncertain, and rare, yet it mattered deeply. It shaped endurance, gave meaning to loyalty, and offered a vision of a future where chains no longer bound. For Rome, it was a way to maintain order, dangling the promise of reward to encourage obedience. For the enslaved, it was the difference between despair and survival. Though most never tasted it, the possibility of freedom lived in every whispered prayer, in every saved coin, in every glance toward the horizon. Manumission was not only an act of law. It was a dream that kept the enslaved human, reminding them that even within the empire of chains, hope still had power. Part 13. The Philosophy of Chains. Rome was a civilization that prided itself on reason, on law, and on order. Its senators debated endlessly. Its generals planned campaigns with precision. Its architects measured arches and domes with mathematical skill. In this world of careful thought and deliberate structure, slavery was not hidden in shame, but accepted as a foundation. For Romans, the existence of slaves was as natural as the rising of the sun or the flowing of the Tiber. Their philosophy of chains was not whispered or concealed. It was spoken openly, written into laws, and taught by thinkers who claimed to understand the nature of humanity itself. Roman law made the position clear. A slave was not a citizen, not a free person, not even fully recognized as a human being in the eyes of the state. The term used was res, a thing, property like a cart or a field. This legal definition meant that a master could buy, sell, punish, or even kill a slave without trial. The only restraint lay in the master's reputation or conscience, and conscience was often shaped more by custom than by compassion. The law did not ask whether slavery was right. It assumed that it was. Philosophers added their voices to this assumption. Many of them drew on Greek traditions, for Greek thinkers had long wrestled with the idea of freedom and bondage. Aristotle had spoken centuries earlier of natural slaves, men supposedly born with the capacity to serve, lacking the full reason needed for freedom. Though not all Romans quoted him directly, his ideas lingered in their culture. To many, slavery seemed not a crime, but a division of roles, one group destined to command and another to obey. Some Stoic philosophers softened the view without rejecting it. They taught that true freedom was an inner state, that a wise man could remain free in spirit even while bound in chains. This teaching offered comfort to those who listened, but it also allowed Rome to maintain its system without guilt. A master might believe that by instructing his slaves in philosophy, he was offering them dignity, even while their bodies remained under the lash. The paradox was never resolved. Others spoke with unease about cruelty. Writers such as Seneca urged masters to treat slaves with moderation, to remember that they too were human beings who felt pain and deserved kindness. He described how a wise man might dine with his slaves, speak to them as companions, and avoid needless harshness. Yet even in these reflections, the institution itself was not condemned. The suggestion was not to end slavery, but to temper it. The chains remained unquestioned. Roman society found practical reasons to justify its reliance on bondage. The empire's economy depended on labor from the enslaved. Fields of grain, vineyards heavy with grapes, mines deep with all of these required countless hands. Without slaves, the villas of the wealthy would fall silent, the markets would empty, the roads would crumble. To many Romans, the question was not whether slavery was just, but how best to manage it. Manuals on agriculture gave advice on feeding slaves, disciplining them, and arranging their quarters as if they were livestock to be cared for efficiently. The religion of Rome offered little challenge. The gods of Olympus and the household spirits were served by both free and enslaved alike, but the rituals did not question social order. In prayers and sacrifices, the distinctions of class were maintained. A slave might assist in a ceremony, but the offering was in the name of the master. In temples across the empire, chains were not symbols of sin, but of stability. And yet, even in this world of acceptance, doubts appeared. Some thinkers, reflecting on the cruelty of punishments or the humanity visible in their servants, wondered whether the institution could truly be called natural. Epictetus, himself once a slave, spoke of dignity that no master could destroy. Though he accepted the existence of slavery, his teachings carried a quiet reminder that freedom was more universal than Rome cared to admit. Other writers noted that fortune could reverse roles. A master could fall into debt or be captured in war, finding himself chained. If anyone could become a slave, was it truly destiny that divided men? These questions rarely grew into open condemnation. To challenge slavery in Rome would have been to challenge the structure of society itself. Too many lives, too much wealth, too much pride rested on the backs of the enslaved. And so, even as philosophers urged kindness, as poets described the suffering of the lowly, the chains continued. Rome praised liberty for its citizens, building temples to liberty itself, while at the same time holding millions in bondage. The contradiction was clear, yet few seemed troubled enough to end it. For the enslaved, this philosophy of chains was both crushing and revealing. To hear oneself described as a thing, to know that thinkers spoke of natural slaves was to feel the weight of erasure. But it also revealed the fear behind the arguments. If slavery were truly natural, why did philosophers need to justify it at all? Why did laws need to remind masters of their power? The very effort to defend the system showed that its foundations were not as secure as Rome liked to believe. The philosophy of chains offered no comfort to those who bent under whips or dug in mines. But it shows us how deeply slavery was woven into Roman thought. It was not hidden or debated in secrecy. It was declared in law, written in books, preached in schools. The Romans believed themselves a people of reason, yet reason itself was used to defend the cruelty upon which their empire stood. The brutal life of slaves was not only a matter of labor and punishment, it was also a matter of words, of ideas that denied their humanity while celebrating the freedom of others. This philosophy of chains reminds us that oppression is not sustained only by force, but also by thought. Rome's thinkers gave their empire a story that justified bondage, and that story endured as long as the empire itself. For the enslaved, it was one more chain, invisible but heavy, binding them not only in body, but in the minds of those who ruled them. Part 14. The Legacy of Rome's Slavery. Rome called itself the City of Liberty. Citizens spoke proudly of their rights, of their power to vote in assemblies, of their freedom under law. In marble inscriptions and in the rhetoric of senators, liberty was celebrated as the defining gift of Rome. Yet that liberty rested on an unspoken truth. It was built on the absence of liberty for millions of others. The Roman world of freedom was possible only because the majority of its labor was performed by those who had none. Slavery was not simply a feature of Roman life. It was its foundation, and its legacy endured long after the empire itself had faded. The economy of Rome was shaped by chains. Vast estates stretched across Italy and the provinces, worked by enslaved men and women who plowed the soil, harvested the crops, and tended the animals. Grain from Sicily and Africa fed the capital, oil from Hispania filled amphorae that lined warehouses, and wine from Gaul and Italy filled the cups of citizens. Each product, each coin of profit, each feast and festival depended on the silent labor of slaves. Without them, the markets would have emptied, the granaries gone bare, the tables of the elite left wanting. In the mines, deep veins of silver and gold, copper and iron, were pried loose by hands that would never hold the wealth they produced. The empire's coinage, its weapons, its statues, and its temples were all funded by resources torn from the earth by the condemned. When Romans admired the gleam of silver or the strength of iron, they seldom thought of the costs of miners or the broken bodies abandoned in darkness. The wealth that funded armies and monuments was drawn from misery buried deep beneath the ground. Slavery also shaped Roman households. Every aspect of elite life was touched by the service of others. Villas echoed with the footsteps of attendants, kitchens filled with cooks and cleaners, children raised by nurses and tutors. Even modest households often owned one or two slaves, for the possession of human beings was a mark of respectability as much as wealth. To live without slaves was to live as poor. To live with them was to signal status. This measure of worth became so ingrained that slavery defined not only the economy, but the very structure of Roman society. The culture of Rome absorbed this reliance. Plays written for the stage often included slaves as characters, sometimes as fools, sometimes as clever tricksters, always as figures taken for granted. Poets described the loyalty of household servants, the beauty of enslaved concubines, the tragedy of separations, but they rarely questioned the system itself. Historians chronicled rebellions, but more as warnings of disorder than as condemnations of injustice. Even philosophy, which sought to ask what was just and natural, bent itself to the service of custom, speaking of moderation rather than abolition. The contradiction between liberty and slavery stood at the heart of Roman identity. A citizen could stand in the forum, declare his freedom, and celebrate his independence from kingship, all while being carried in a litter borne by slaves. Senators spoke of the dignity of Roman law, even as they signed decrees that defined human beings as property. Emperors displayed their power through grand spectacles, in which gladiators, many of them enslaved, fought and died for the amusement of the crowd. The very word freedom gained meaning only because so many were denied it. The legacy of slavery reached even into Rome's politics. Freedmen, those who had once been slaves but had gained liberty, often played important roles in imperial administration. Some became advisors, secretaries, or financial officers, wielding influence close to the emperor. Their rise testified to the skill and intelligence of those once enslaved, but it also revealed how deeply slavery was woven into the machinery of power. Even in freedom, they remained tied to the identity of having once been property, their status a reminder of the system that had shaped them. The violence used to enforce slavery left its mark as well. Crucifixions lined roadsides, a public theater of fear. Whippings, brandings, and collars carved humiliation into the flesh of millions. These punishments were not only acts of discipline, but performances meant to remind the enslaved and the free alike of the gulf that separated them. The brutality of Rome was not hidden in corners. It it was displayed openly, woven into the spectacle of empire. When Rome fell, the institution of slavery did not vanish. Successor kingdoms inherited it, adapting it to new economies and new faiths. Christianity, which rose within the empire and eventually became its dominant religion, did not abolish slavery but reinterpreted it. Early Christian writers urged masters to treat slaves kindly, reminded slaves to obey with humility, but seldom called for freedom. The chains of Rome thus echoed through centuries, carried into the medieval world, transformed but never erased. The memory of Spartacus lingered as well, not in Rome's triumphal records, but in the whispers of later generations. His rebellion revealed the possibility of resistance, the truth that fear could be broken. Though Rome crucified him and lined its roads with the bodies of his followers, it could not crucify the idea of freedom. That idea, fragile yet enduring, became part of the legacy too, carried forward as an inspiration for struggles long after Rome had fallen. Today, when we walk the ruins of amphitheaters or admire the arches of aqueducts, it is easy to see only the glory of Roman achievement. The stones stand silent, the mosaics glitter faintly, the columns rise toward the sky. But behind each monument lies a hidden history of labor without reward, of lives spent and forgotten. The roads that stretched across continents were paved by hands that were never free to walk them in choice. The statues carved for emperors were shaped by men who owned nothing, not even themselves. The legacy of Rome's greatness is also the legacy of Rome's cruelty. For the enslaved, that legacy was not measured in monuments, but in the fragile lines of survival they carved within oppression. It was carried in the songs whispered at night, in the prayers spoken to distant gods, in the bonds of love formed despite chains. These traces did not survive in marble or inscription, but they endure in the truth that humanity could not be entirely erased. Even within the most brutal system, people found ways to remain human. The legacy of Roman slavery, then, is twofold. It is the grandeur of empire built on the suffering of millions, and it is the persistence of those millions who endured, resisted, and hoped. Rome celebrated liberty while denying it. It declared itself eternal, but it fell. What remained were the lessons of its contradictions, that wealth built on chains is fragile, that power sustained by cruelty is temporary, and that even the mightiest empire cannot silence the longing for freedom. The brutal life of slaves in Rome did not end with their deaths. Its legacy stretched into the centuries that followed, shaping societies across Europe and beyond. To remember Rome is to remember not only its emperors and its battles, its temples and its laws, but also the countless men, women, and children whose labor made it possible. Their names are lost, their stories fragmented, but their lives built the world we still study. In their silence, in their endurance, lies the truest legacy of Rome. Part 15. A Day in Chains. Reflections. The life of a Roman slave was not measured in years or in seasons, but in days that repeated endlessly. To understand what it meant to live in chains, it is enough to follow one day from beginning to end, a day that could have been lived by countless men, women, and children across the empire. Each moment reveals the weight of servitude, and together they form a picture of a life defined by duty, silence, and endurance. The day begins before dawn. The air is still cool, shadows heavy in the corners of the barracks. A horn sounds, sharp in the silence, or perhaps an overseer's voice shouts through the darkness. Slaves rise quickly, some stiff from yesterday's work, others coughing from illness or dust that never leaves their lungs. There is no time to stretch or linger. Rough bread is handed out, sometimes with a little porridge or beans if fortune allows. It is swallowed quickly, not savored, because the day is already pressing forward. In the countryside, workers shuffle out into the fields as the first light touches the horizon. Chains rattle faintly as men and women take up their tools, sickles, hoes, baskets. Overseers on horseback or with staffs walk among them, eyes sharp, ready to punish any sign of slowness. The work begins with the rising sun and will not end until it sets. Each back bends, each arm swings, each step repeats. The sound of sickles slicing through stalks, the scrape of hoes against soil, the thud of baskets set down and lifted again fills the air. The fields seem endless and the hours stretch long. In the city, the morning looks different but feels the same. Domestic slaves prepare the villa before the master stirs. Floors are swept, lamps trimmed, water heated. Clothing is laid out carefully, sandals polished. The cook is already at the hearth, smoke rising as bread is baked, meat spitted, herbs crushed. Children are woken and dressed by nurses, their laughter or tears echoing through halls while servants move quietly to soothe them. Everything must be ready when the master calls, for delay is met with scolding and mistakes with punishment. The hours pass in steady labor. In the fields, sweat runs down backs as the sun climbs higher. Hands blister, shoulders ache, but the pace does not slow. Water is rationed, food meager, rest almost non-existent. In the city, servants move constantly, carrying water jars, polishing silver, answering doors, running errands. A secretary might sit in a corner with wax tablets, recording accounts, or taking dictation, his stylus scratching steadily. A tutor leads children through lessons, reciting lines of Homer or Cicero, his mind wandering to memories of his own lost freedom. Every task is performed under watchful eyes, for even the most trusted know they are never truly safe. At midday, there may be a short pause. In the countryside, workers crouch in the shade of a tree or wall, eating bread and beans, drinking water that tastes of dust. The break is brief, often only long enough to swallow a mouthful and catch a breath. In the city, slaves serve the household's meal first, carrying platters, pouring wine, clearing dishes before eating scraps in the kitchen. The difference is stark. The masters recline on couches, tasting delicacies from far provinces, while those who serve them chew crusts in silence. The afternoon drags on. Heat presses down in the fields. Tools grow heavier, backs more weary. Overseers shout and strike to keep the pace. In the villa, preparations for evening meals or gatherings begin. Floors are polished again, couches arranged, lamps filled with oil. Servants rehearse their duties silently, each knowing where to stand, when to move, what gesture will bring a nod of approval instead of a frown. Musicians tune their instruments, ready to fill the dining hall with melody while never daring to claim attention for themselves. The day edges toward evening, but the work does not ease. In the countryside, the harvest must be gathered before dark. In the city, the dinner must run smoothly, with every course presented in order, every cup filled before it is empty. Slaves stand behind their masters' chairs, silent and invisible, watching the flick of a hand that signals a command. Laughter and conversation rise among the free, but the servants hear them only as background to their own concentration. When the sun sets, labor continues still. Fields must be tidied, tools put away, animals tended. In the villa, guests depart and servants clear the remnants of the feast, carrying trays of scraps, wiping spills, extinguishing lamps one by one. Exhaustion is heavy, but rest is not yet allowed. The master's bed must be prepared, his sandals removed, his comfort ensured. Only when he sleeps can the household begin to slow. At last, the slaves return to their quarters. In the countryside, barracks are crowded, filled with the smell of sweat and smoke. Bodies collapse onto straw, some groaning softly with pain. In the city, servants retreat to small windowless rooms, a few lying close together, others curled alone in corners. There may be whispered conversations in the dark, fragments of stories about homelands, prayers to distant gods, hopes for freedom that might never come. Children cling to parents, mothers hum lullabies despite their weariness. For a moment, humanity surfaces again, fragile but real. The night is short. Dreams are broken by the knowledge that dawn will bring the same routine again. Chains may rattle in sleep, collars chafe against skin. Some rise quietly in the dark, looking out at the stars if they can, wondering if loved ones far away see the same sky. For many, memory is the only refuge, a reminder that life was once different, or that somewhere freedom still exists. This day, with its endless cycle of labor and obedience, its small moments of kindness, and its constant weight of fear, was not exceptional. It was ordinary. It was the rhythm lived by millions across the empire. In cities and fields, in mines and kitchens, the details varied, but the essence was the same: a life not their own, a body owned by another, a spirit tested by chains. The brutal life of Roman slaves cannot be understood only in numbers, in laws, or in grand events. It must be felt in the weariness of rising before dawn, in the sting of the whip across shoulders, in the taste of stale bread, in the fear of punishment, and in the quiet moments when humanity flickered despite everything. To live a day in chains was to carry the weight of an empire's prosperity, while receiving none of its liberty. As we reflect on this day, on these lives, we see the legacy not of triumph, but of endurance. Rome celebrated its freedom, its wealth, its glory. But that freedom was built on the suffering of others, and that wealth was purchased with broken bodies. The monuments we still admire stand on foundations of labor never freely given. The empire's memory is incomplete without the millions whose names are lost but whose days, repeated endlessly, made Rome possible. This story does not end with escape or victory. It ends with silence at night, with weary bodies lying close together, with hope carried quietly into sleep. For most, that was all that remained. And yet, within that silence, within that weariness, within that fragile hope, there is a truth more enduring than Rome itself, that even in chains people remained human, and that the longing for freedom could never be wholly extinguished. And so, we come to the end of this journey through the shadows of Rome. We have walked alongside the enslaved in their fields and their kitchens, in their mines and their barracks, in their moments of suffering and in their fragile sparks of hope. Their lives so often erased from the grand stories of emperors and generals were the true foundation of the empire. Without them, Rome would not have risen, its monuments would not have stood, and its armies would not have marched. As we reflect, we are reminded that history is not only the story of the powerful, it is also the story of those who bore the weight of power without choice. The men and women who lived and died in chains left little behind but silence, yet in that silence we can still hear their endurance. If this story has spoken to you, I invite you to pause, to breathe, and to carry forward the memory of those millions whose names are lost but whose labor built the ancient world. Their suffering reminds us of the cost of empires, and their quiet humanity reminds us of what it means to endure. Thank you for joining me here in this long reflection. If you would like to hear more calm journeys into the past, please consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a gentle like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Each small gesture helps us continue creating stories where history becomes a place of rest as much as remembrance. Until next time, may your night be peaceful, your thoughts quiet, and your dreams free of chains.